First order of business, quite importantly, is to prepare your buttonholes, so that especially at the cuff we know there's enough space for the holes and sewing them, what with the lining being there. Mark them on. For the cuff, the rule is about 3–3.5 centimeters above the cuff, 1.3 centimeters from the edge, from the seam, 1.6 centimeters apart, and 1.9 centimeters wide. These are standard measurements for a 4-button cuff, with standard tailor's cuff buttons being about 22 line or 14–15 millimeters. I prefer my buttonholes to be higher up on the cuff, which is why I didn't do the half moon on the mitre when I made the sleeve. We prepare the holes in the normal way that I have illustrated in my buttonhole video. We know where our top button is, and it's usually 1.6 centimeters from the edge and 2.2 centimeters wide. The second button is usually 11 centimeters below it, or 4–4.5 inches below it, but that should change depending on the general proportions of the jacket. The second button will be the same distance from the front edge as the first. The lapel button is 38 millimeters below the top edge and 13 millimeters from the front edge, usually 2.5 centimeters wide. Then there's the flower loop, which I'll get into later. It's the same dimensions except a 1/4 decimeter lower on the underside of the lapel. Machine the buttonholes, but no need to go further than that until the rest of the jacket is finished. With a thread the same color as your fabric, you need to prick stitch along the inside of the break line in order to prevent the top collar fabric from trying to make a break for it when we take off the basting. Start and end securing the thread underneath the melton and prick stitching along. Don't catch through the melton because we don't really want to see any of the stitching except for the prick stitch on the inside. A lot of the time jacket makers will do this stitch after they put on the top collar because it is so important and simultaneously easy to forget. They do it at their first opportunity rather than leave it to the finisher or for finishing. Ideally, we should be using hand silk from a skein like Gutermann, but silk skeins are expensive. I have always used either wax buttonhole twist or waxed machine thread. Finish the stitch on the melton side inside of the undercollar, ideally beneath the seam so that it's hidden. At this point we should stitch the collar to the jacket. Real quick first, trim about 2 millimeters of the collar canvas away underneath the melton if we haven't done that already. And if you think about it, there's almost nothing holding it down at the moment, excluding the basting. Fasten the melton colored thread at either notch on the lapel. We will basically do a long exposed fell stitch. With the thread fastened out of the way, we can start by sewing a 1/2 centimeter under the melton. From there, we can make a line straight towards the fabric. Right where the collar meets the fabric, we are going to stitch into the fabric diagonally, sewing along 1/2 centimeter away from the first line we made. We want to catch as much of everything as we can, excluding the outside jacket fabric and the lining. This stitch will be visible when we're looking at the collar. It simply needs to be very strong, and it's not normally visible anyway when the collar is flipped downwards. We are just going to keep making these vertical lines to hold the collar to the jacket. As we do the stitching, even though it's basted, we need to make sure that it won't move. We need to fix it where it wants to sit, hence it's best to sew it flat with our hand underneath to make sure we don't sew through too much, but not curved over our hands at all. It can be good to do this stitch first because of how little there is holding the collar in place right now. We are going to do this all along the collar and to the other notch where we can fasten the thread again. Here I am fastening some thread at the base of the triangle we had folded onto the melton. We are felling up the first edge to secure it. Before we get right to the top, trim off the top of the triangle to trim off any fraying threads before doing a small cross stitch along the top to prevent it from fraying any more. at the other side fell down the other folded edge. When felling both edges, we should hold the collar such that it is slightly folded inwards so that it won't perk up at all. At the very least, make sure it isn't folded outwards. We can fasten the thread at the base again. Without starting a new stitch, I want to do the same vertical bar between the top collar and the melton on the outer edge of the collar. I want to trim some of the melton away from the edge to stop it from peeking out from under the top collar though. There isn't much to sew between, so it is important that when we do the understitch it doesn't show on the outside of the top collar. We can stitch through the canvas, it doesn't matter. This isn't much of a pressure point, so between the fabric and melton is enough. Fastening the thread underneath the other triangle before felling, trimming, cross-stitching and felling down that one as well. To sew the gorge line, we can start inside of the seam between the folded edges of the gorge line to invisibly fasten the thread. As in my first video, we are going to lattice stitch these seams together. If at any point we think the fabric needs to be released or the curve needs to be neatened, then we can do that before fixing it. It is usually best to start on the inside of the jacket so that we can spend a few centimeters learning and getting used to the stitch in the material as we get to the front so that it's neater. I'm not this time, but c'est la vie. When we get to the lining, we can fold it up and out of the way to a small amount to tack the thread in place. To be honest, going back to after I attached the undercollar to the jacket, I would do the vertical bar stitch across the edge of the fall of the collar, then start the gorge lines at the lining, tack the thread without cutting, and then fasten the triangle. So just changing the order that I finish the things in. To finish the shoulder or neck lining, we'll just simply secure the thread under the sleeve lining and fel across the back lining to the other sleeve and moor it underneath the other sleeve. Something I might suggest is to increase the density of the stitches at more strained points, like the corners and centre back. That way you might have twice the number of stitches at the pressure points. Sewing the lining side seam, firstly, don't accidentally sew down the pleat under the sleeve. I did that once, I think only once, and that was a bit of a ball ache. Once again, we'll start under the sleeve lining and filling down. we want to start at the armhole both times so that if there's too much ease, it'll go under the hem, as opposed to whatever would have to happen if we started at the bottom. As we stitch down, it's very important that we only stitch the linings together. As I said when we basted, we might want to be able to get our finger in behind the seam to make sure of that. When we get down to the hem, we need to preserve the curtainy bit and stitch the two pieces of lining down, then back up the seam. It gets difficult here because we need to keep the 6 total layers of lining apart, only sewing 3 together at once. It is much easier to just let down the hem and sew the side seam before we put up or sew down the side seam before we put the hem up in the first place. When we're done, we can just fasten the thread on the end of the lining and put the hem back up. With regard to the vent, we start at the top as well, like we would if we had double vents. That way you can change the ease if necessary. I'm starting on the top vent, fastening the thread at the highest point to begin felling towards the hem. We will get to the corner of the lining and then we start sewing the hem. An important feature that the jacket lining hem has is the ballast. I went over it in, I think, my first video and the centre back vent sample video, but again we need to fell the lining to the hem 2 centimeters behind the folded up hem through one layer so that the lining can move more freely. Starting from the vent, we could either leave the last 2 centimeters freely moving or, like I am, fell to the corner and curve up to the 2 centimeter point above the folded hem of the lining. We are only sewing through the folded hem of the fabric and a single layer of the lining. What might be most easy is to use our needle to stab through one layer of the lining and pull it upwards, then hold it there. Then there will be a single layer of lining to fell to the folded up hem. As we get to the other end of the facing, we will need to curve the stitch down again to get to the point where the hem meets the lining. Then we didn't back tack at the bottom of the lining to the facing, so I'll fell up a little and hitch them together. Sewing the under vent now, we start on the centre back seam of the lining, overlapping the machining so that the stitches hold each other in place. I want to mostly only sew the top lining to the other layer of lining, but definitely not through the back fabric. We are just sewing down the back to the corner, turning to the other side of the vent, then down towards the hem again. Importantly, we need to transfer from filling the lining to the undervent at the same point that we sewed the vent. You might like to reinforce said point a little bit as well, just tacking it. Then it's sewing the lining to the vent, down to the hem where it's repeating the same as what's on the other half of the jacket. The ballast then overlapping the stitching on the facing. For the front edge, start at the bottom of the facing next to the lining. The best way balancing result and speed is to do what I've called the half prick stitch, as you'll find in my hand sewing part 2 video, as well as various sample videos. However, at the bottom of the facing, we need to cross stitch over the raw edge of the facing. Trim away the basting holding it and trim any fraying bits of the weave. Fasten the thread at the top and cross stitch down. You might like to go over it twice, but tack the thread at the bottom so that we can start the prick stitch. At the bottom, we'll sew from the front of the jacket and curve the bottom over our hand in order to preserve the shape. All the way, though we don't want to pull the stitches too tight, otherwise that'll cause pronounced dimples all the way along the edge of the jacket. Which is an effect you may want, but if you want that, it's very necessary that each stitch is equidistant from the edge all the way along to create a straight line. Something subtle across the curve we could do is to make sure that the front edge is curved properly. We are able to make subtle changes with our permanent stitch just to make sure that the edge isn't jagged, that it is a continuous uninterrupted curve. We have to make sure that we don't pull the stitches too much to the point that it draws in the fabric, creating rumpling and basically shortening the edge. We'll prick stitch all the way up to the break point, where we'll start doing the same thing from the facing side. As we get up to the break point, since both sides of the edge are most visible, we might like to use the double prick stitch for this short section. This way we are in complete control of the prick on both sides, while it isn't efficient to do that all the way around since it just takes so long and it's not seen. In this section, because it can be visible on both sides, it may be worth it. When we get to the top of the lapel, stitch into the notch, and at the point that the top collar meets the lapel, just reinforce it a tiny amount with a couple of stitches. Continue then to prick stitch up the collar following the edge. In the somewhat likely event that we need to change our thread at some point doing this long prick, we can start by securing our current thread in the seam of the edge. It is the least obtrusive method. We can hide a longish tail of thread between the fabric again. To restart from about where we ended, start with hiding a tail of thread between the fabric, proceeding to do a couple of stitches on top of one another in the seam again, just continuing the prick from there. When we finish at the bottom edge, it's the same as how we started, trimming away any frayed bits of cloth and cross-stitching up under the lining, fastening the thread. For the cross pockets, essentially we just need to prick stitch the perimeter of the pocket flaps and across the breast pocket. We could remove the basting on the welts to make this easier, though leave the basting on the flap for a minute. We can start with a knot and fasten that underneath the flap in the welt, beginning to prick stitch along the perimeter. Like the front edge, prick stitch it so that on the underside there is a minimal amount of thread showing. We can alter the curve on the flap to be smoother if needs be. Again, we're not prick stitching for the good of our health. We need to secure the folded edge permanently to replace the baste. So we are still cleaning the lining underneath the flap to make sure it isn't poking out from behind the cloth. We can fasten the thread underneath the flap like how we started. Do a few stitches in the same place and hide the thread between the layers of fabric somewhere. There are a few ideas about reinforcing the edges of pockets here. You might like to do a couple of detacks, or not, and maybe you want something more subtle, then you can just do a stitch in the seam between the welts and the jacket without making a D of prick stitches. Something that I decided to leave in is that I had poorly sewn one of my flap pockets, so I needed to rerun the front edge of it so that it is more parallel with the front edge of the jacket. I marked on where I want the edge, and then I need to remove the basting currently holding it wrong. Basically, I'm prick stitching it like normal, except I rolled the cloth into the correct position as I go. This is an extreme example of course correction, but it might be useful to much more visually see what you can do here. Like I did for the Outbreast pocket sample, we need to prick stitch across the top of the welt to hold the fold in place. When sewing the sleeve lining's armhole, don't start on the crown with the ease, either the front or back or like the underarm, basically anywhere, and just fell around. Fasten the thread underneath the sleeve lining and begin to fell around the armhole, either direction. Like when basting the sleeve lining on, we can fill the sleeve lining through the jacket lining to the canvas or shoulder pad as appropriate, except of course where there is neither of those below the back pitch. It is important that we are only sewing the two linings together, not through the jacket fabric. In my experience, to fell stitch the ease, what we need to do is with our needle, we'll go into the jacket lining and come out our normal 3 or 4 millimeters ahead without catching the sleeve lining immediately. A millimeter or two ahead of where we came out of the jacket, then take the normal amount of the sleeve lining, pulling the stitch tight, going back into the jacket lining where we first came out a millimeter or two back, and we'll have trapped 4 to 6 millimeters of sleeve lining over 3 to 4 millimeters of jacket lining. Turn the sleeve out and we want to start on the underside, i.e. the one that we'll attach the buttons to. Fasten the thread under the basted lining and fell down. When we get to the cuff, we'll fell the edge of the lining straight to the undersleeve. Unlike the hem of the jacket, there isn't any ballast. There may be some ease to fell in as well though. Fell back up the cuff. At the top, make sure that the undercuff is snug into the lining of the other sleeve. We might release the basting there a little to let us work with it more easily. We'll keep felling up the seam to secure it since the seam wasn't back tacked like the vent. Or did I? I don't remember. Hide the tail of the thread and cut away the excess, do the other one, and you're all done. Given I've gone over how to make buttonholes and where we put them, I already made a joke about padding the runtime for AdSense, I'll leave you to buttonholing your jacket. Or I think I made that joke anyway. Though a good rule of thumb is to start with the 4th and or last button on the back of the cuff and work forward. Then the front button and the Milanese buttonhole on the lapel last. The back 2 of this 4-button cuff are sham buttonholes. I have a guide on buttonholes and a separate guide on shams. I am repeating myself, but this means that we don't cut a hole into our jacket. If we need to lengthen the sleeve for whatever reason, we can unpick the top 1 or 2 holes to put another 1 or 2 underneath, reducing the amount of dead space between the hem of the sleeve and the first buttonhole. The sham buttonholes are also faster to make whilst not really sacrificing the effect. The hand embroidery is still present in the jacket. We are making the buttonhole stitches ideally all the way up to where we would fasten the button. We prepare the buttonholes and remove all of the basting before pressing, but we will put the actual buttons on afterwards. So there is a guide in the jacket construction playlist. For now, I'll leave you with a bad montage of sewing buttonholes and a separate video on removing the basting.